Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Mastering the Art and Science of Exponential Smoothing. My name is Dinesh Shah, and I'm the founder of Supply Chain Business Solutions based in Sydney, Australia. Our partnership with Business Forecast Systems goes back to year 2000, and today we have partnered with them to bring this important webinar very relevant to the digital era we all live in. We can begin the webinar. We'll begin the webinar shortly, but let's first go over a few logistics. The webinar presentation will run approximately 50 minutes, and we will save time at the end for Q&A. During the webinar, you can submit questions at any time using the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. We'll be monitoring these questions throughout the webinar, and we'll compile a list of Q&A at the end of the presentation. We'll also take questions submitted during the Q&A session itself. We'll do our best to get through all the questions, as many questions as possible. If we do not get to your question, you will receive a follow-up email after the conclusion of the webinar. We also will be recording this webinar and will email you a link to the video sometime next week when it is available. All previously presented webinars are archived and available for viewing on demand at forecastpro.com and also Forecastpro YouTube channel. Obviously, you will notice attendees will receive an email notifying them when the recording and materials are available. With that, I will now hand it over to Eric Stelwagen to introduce himself and kick off today's webinar, Mastering the Art and Science of Exponential Smoothing.
Thank you. As the slide says, my name is Eric Stelwagen, and I am the CEO and co-founder of Business Forecast Systems. That's the company that develops and markets the Forecast Pro software line. I have been working in the field of business forecasting essentially my entire professional career. And I have had the experience of going into lots of different companies and working with them and seeing how they approach forecasting. Okay, this is what we're going to be covering today. So it's a roadmap of how we'll spend the next hour or so. We're going to start pretty general and talk a little bit about exponential smoothing and how it works and how it's applied. And then we're going to go into several examples. And part of what we'll be exploring is sort of the steps involved in building and interpreting an exponential smoothing model. We'll also be considering some extensions to exponential smoothing, which are fairly useful. And after that, we'll summarize and move on to questions and answers. So let's actually get started. Exponential smoothing is a very popular forecasting method. Basically, in all the surveys of what methods people use to generate forecasts, other than spreadsheets and judgment, usually if you're using a statistical method, exponential smoothing is often there. And there's some good reasons for that. So what are some of the pros here? Simple to understand and explain. I would say exponential smoothing is simpler to understand and simpler to explain than many of the other statistical forecasting methods. And that's because it revolves around things like trends and seasonal patterns. And these are things that people already have a conceptual understanding of what is a trend, what is a seasonal pattern. Some of the more involved statistical methods, deal with things like correlations in time, and it might be harder to explain to, say, a manager how those methods operate. They're widely accepted and used. That's absolutely true. Very often when you have an automatic approach to forecasting, something that might be embedded in, say, your ERP or your demand planning system or what have you, you're going to find exponential smoothing behind the scenes. So it's a very widely and very accepted method. It's also performed well, both in terms of just sort of anecdotally, when you talk to companies about how the methods work, you often find that they're pretty pleased with exponential smoothing, particularly for their established products, as well as in academic studies. So there have been some academic studies where they basically try different methodologies and see which ones perform best. And exponential smoothing has been a pretty good performer. The method is adaptive. And what I mean by that is that as things are changing, as say the trends in your data change or the seasonal patterns change, exponential smoothing is very good at adapting to that change and forecasting conditions as they exist at the end of your data. So again, if the trends are changing in time, the forecasts are going to reflect the current trends. And if the seasonal patterns are changing, the forecasts are going to reflect the current seasonal pattern because it will adapt to any changes that are being made. It's also robust. What do I mean by that? Robust is what I'm trying to convey here is that it's good at smoothing out over rough data. And the name exponential smoothing kind of suggests that. So if you have a lot of random variation in the data, exponential smoothing is often a pretty good choice because it can sort of smooth out that rough data. It's easy to apply, and in fact, it can be automated. And that's pretty useful, particularly if you're forecasting, lots and lots of items. If I'm forecasting, thousands of SKUs, exponential smoothing is the fact that I can automate it is rather convenient. Okay, so that's the upside. What about the downside? Well, exponential smoothing is what I call a time series method. And what I mean by that is it's going to generate the forecasts strictly based on the past history of what you're trying to forecast. So if I'm forecasting demand for a product, it's going to be based on what has the historic demand been for that product. Because of that, it's not going to capture things that are moving around the calendar. So let's say I promote this item, and there are times where I promote it in January, and maybe last year I promoted it in September, and next year I'm going to I'm going to promote it in March. That's an example of something that's moving around the calendar. And because smoothing is projecting solely based on the past, it doesn't have information about how your promotions have been moving around the calendar. So it's not going to capture things that move around the calendar. It also is not going to allow you to bring in what's called explanatory variables. Let's say there are variables that are driving your demand. Let's say that you're constantly, let's say you're forecasting something that's driven by temperature. So, for example, if I work for an electric power company and I'm trying to forecast demand for electricity, on real hot days, people tend to run their air conditioning and use a lot more electricity. So that bringing in stuff like temperature data to help forecast makes a lot of sense for an application like that. Or maybe I'm driven by economic factors like interest rates or things like that. Exponential smoothing as an extrapolative method is not going to allow me to bring these types of variables into the model. And if they're important, then I probably shouldn't be using exponential smoothing. Implementations vary and some are poor. There are certain statistical methods where there are absolutely standard ways of building and optimizing models. So regression is like that. So if I build a regression model in Forecast Pro and I build the same regression model in Excel and I build the same regression model in SAS, the forecasts are going to be exactly the same because there are just standard ways of building the model and generating the forecasts. Box-Jenkins or RIMA models, same thing. Smoothing is not like that. There are a lot of decisions that have to be made. And if you build an exponential smoothing model in Forecast Pro and another in SAS, you're going to get slightly different answers. And it has to do with some of the implementation decisions that are made. I have seen some implementations of exponential smoothing that are truly poor. And they're usually taking big shortcuts in the interest of being able to build the models quickly. So they're sort of sacrificing accuracy for performance. So you need to be careful about that. Just because two different software packages support exponential smoothing does not mean they'll give you the same forecast. Okay, so we are going to look at how exponential smoothing models work, but before we do that, we're actually going to go into Excel and talk a little bit about data length. And again, what we're doing is extrapolating from the past. And so I want to show you some data and start to think about how you would extrapolate from the past. So I'm going to bring up Excel here, and we're actually looking at a data set, a very, very short one. If you look closely, you'll see a little dot right here, and it's about 37,000. And what I'm suggesting is, what if that's the only information I have about sales? I have 1 month worth of sales, and it has a value of 37,000. And I put it in, let's say, an automatic, software that's going to generate a forecast. And maybe it will use exponential smoothing, maybe it'll use something else. But what kind of forecast would it generate with only one data point? I think if you think about this, you'll realize there's just not a lot you can do here if the only information you have is that one data point. It would be logical to just say the forecast going forward will be the same. It'll be that 37,000, and we'll just have a flat line as a forecast. That would be reasonable if I knew nothing about the data. And so the only thing I know is that one data point. That's not the way the real world works. And that's part of the point here, is that if you are using an automatic approach that's going to generate a forecast using exponential smoothing or an automatic time series method, and you only give it one data point, there's not a lot we can do. And it's going to forecast that data point as a straight line. So let's get a little more data. What if we had 3 months? So here's 3 months. And I've got one point, it's actually a little above 37,000. The next one's a little below. The third one's right up about there. What am I going to do now? Are the data trended? Are they seasonal? I really can't say. I just only have 3 data points. And I think a pretty reasonable approach to forecasting this would be to just average those 3 data points. And so I'd end up again with a flat line, and due to just not having enough data. So let's get some more data. Here's 12 months worth of data. For some people, 12 months is actually quite a bit of data. Are the data trended? If you look at that graph and say take out a ruler and do a best fit line, you might say, yeah, maybe it's trended downwards a little bit. Okay. Or maybe you just say, I think I'll still just keep on averaging these. So maybe we've got a little bit of a downward trend, maybe not. Are the data seasonal? We have 12 data points. I can't compare the data to the same month to the previous year because I only have 12 data points. So the data go up and down. Okay, they wiggle, if you will. Are they wiggling because they're seasonal? And my forecast should be seasonal, that they'll continue to go up and down. Or am I just selling a certain amount and anytime, any given month is above or below that amount? And so maybe it's not seasonal and I want to forecast, say, either at sort of this level or maybe a slight downward trend. The point here is that I have 12 months worth of data. And if I'm going to use exponential smoothing or another time series method to extrapolate, really basic questions like, are the data trended? Are they seasonal? Is very hard to answer authoritatively. Let's get some more data. Now I have 2 years worth of data. Are the data trended? Okay, visually, I think they're pretty flat. So I'm probably pretty comfortable saying the forecast should be pretty flat going forward. Are they seasonal? Yes. If I start to look closely and I see this like trough month and I go a year back, there it is as well. And it goes up and second one goes up a little more and then it drops. And if I trace that same pattern here, I think you can see that there is a pattern here. It's not perfect, but it is repeating itself. And so we've got a seasonal pattern. and my forecast with 2 years worth of data would probably not be very trended, but it would have a seasonal pattern around it. Let's get some more data. Now we've got 3 years worth of data, and you can see that our forecast that we made, say, last year would have undershot because we were not going to forecast a trend. What do I want to do now? Are these data trended? And what I mean by that is, should I look at this data and say it's moving upwards and it should continue to move upwards in the forecast period? So I'm going to forecast a trend. Or is it really, well, it was at this level and now it's shifted, and maybe I should just forecast this as a level shift and not as a trended series. So I now have 3 years worth of data. The seasonal pattern has become pretty easy to spot, but the trend is still problematic. And this is a real data set. Let's get some more data. Here's 6 years worth of data. And with this amount of data, everything becomes very clear. Are the data trended? Yeah, obviously they're trended. There's a real strong upward trend here, and I expect that to continue, and I'm going to forecast an upward trend. So something that was impossible to know with 1 or 3 or 12 data points becomes really easy to know with 6 years worth of data. Are the data seasonal? Oh yeah, they're very seasonal. I can just see that with my eyeballs. So again, that's the whole point, is the more data I have, the easier it is to recognize structure in the data, characteristics like sales levels, trends, seasonal patterns. When I look at this, I say, yeah, it's a little flat in the beginning, but then the trend really picks up. It's been seasonal the whole time, etc. So again, the reason I'm taking time to look at this data set is to get you thinking about, if I'm going to extrapolate from the past, I really want to have, the more data I have, the better. And if I only have a month's worth of data, then techniques like exponential smoothing and other extrapolation methods are just not going to work very well. Now, what I've done here, though, is kind of unfair, because business people don't forecast this way. We don't say, here's one data point, it's 37,000, give me a forecast. They know what the data represent. And so I should tell you what this data represent. This data comes from an internet service provider, and it's installations. So it's how many installations they've done on a monthly basis. If I worked for this company and I was given 1 month of data and I was told these are residential installations, and I say, here's the data. Is it seasonal? And it's like, yeah, of course it's seasonal. It's installation data, and we don't install as many in December as we do in other months, etc. So my knowledge of the data would allow me to answer questions that a visual inspection of the data doesn't allow, or even a statistical analysis of the data wouldn't allow. The fact that I know what we're forecasting means that I don't need to have, 6 years worth of data to know whether it's seasonal or whether it's trended. And I may be in a position like this 2 months where I know something about the future that's going to want me to say, yeah, I really do think this is trended, and my expectation is that it's going to increase going forward. So again, if we're relying on automatic methods and statistical methods, we're just feeding it data. It's a stream of numbers. It doesn't have a great deal of knowledge about what those numbers represent. And methods like exponential smoothing and other extrapolation methods are all about the data. You, as a forecaster, bring more information to the table. We call the knowledge of your data domain knowledge, and your domain knowledge will often guide you in forecasting, whether that's model selection or knowing that a forecast is likely to be good or bad. So let's go back to the slides for a second. I'm going to pop over here and let's continue. Okay, so let's talk a little more about exponential smoothing. And first off, exponential smoothing is not a method. It's really a family of models. So there are lots of different models that make up exponential smoothing. The models forecast three different components. One is a sales level, another is trends, and a third, seasonal patterns. So exponential smoothing revolves around these three data components. Exponential smoothing assumes that each of these components will be changing in time, that the trend last year might be different than the current trend, or the seasonal pattern last year might be different than the current seasonal pattern. So one of the things the method has to do is allow these components, level, trend, and seasonal patterns, to change in time and to forecast current conditions. What are the current trends? What is the current seasonal pattern? It also assumes that there's random variation in the data. And so that there are parts that we can't explain. And people sometimes call that random variation noise. If you think about it, if there's something has a lot of random variation, then you want to do a lot of smoothing or averaging. In other words, if I have a lot of random variation, a lot of random up and down in the data, by averaging out over a long period of time, I can reduce that random variation because the random variation will cancel itself out. On the other hand, if something is changing in time, I want to concentrate on recent information. I don't want to do a lot of smoothing because the more data I use, the further back in the past that I go, the less representative of the current change the data have. So this is kind of a balancing act. If data sets are changing rapidly in time, you want to concentrate on the recent history, and you want to give that a lot of emphasis. On the other hand, if we've got a lot of random variation, then I want to bring in not only the recent history, but also the more distant past, because I can get underneath that noise or that random variation by using more data. So exponential smoothing is kind of all about this opposing force, if you will. It balances how much to emphasize the recent history to capture change effectively with how much to use the past and therefore get underneath the noise. And the way it does this is to use something called smoothing weights. And the smoothing weights reflect the relative emphasis to give the recent history versus the more distant past. So we'll see this in action soon, but this is really the heart of what exponential smoothing does, is it tries to understand how much change there is in the data, how much random variation there is, and sort of optimize how much emphasis to give the recent history versus the more distant past. And the way it does that is using these smoothing weights, which we'll explore. Its goal is that to understand what are the components at the end of the data set. So we call these the final values. What is the level, the sales level at the very end of the data set? That'll be the starting point for our forecast. What's the trend at the end of the data set? Because I'm going to extrapolate that trend to go forward. And what's the seasonal pattern? So these are all things that I'm trying to understand. Okay. Now, this slide is showing pictures of forecasts that would be generated using exponential smoothing models. And it really comes down to four different ways of forecasting a trend. The first way would be it's not trended. So the forecast will be a non-trended line. The second is a linear trend, so sort of a straight line trend. And the question now is, what's the slope? Is it going up or down, and how quickly? Okay. So again, we could forecast it's not trended, in which case the trend component would be a flat line, or that it's a linear trend and it would have a slope to it. There's also something called a damped trend, something that starts off as a linear trend and then dies out over time, and an exponential trend, something that's growing as a percentage of itself. So we have these four different types of trends that we can envision forecasting. In addition to that, there's the seasonal component that's going to be part of our forecast. And there we have three options. It's not seasonal, so all we have to worry about is the trend. It is seasonal, and I'm going to start over here, and it's multiplicative. A multiplicative seasonal pattern is one where you can think about the seasonality as being a percentage. We sell 20% more in December. We sell 10% less in February. And what that means is that as the series grows, as your sales increase, the seasonal variation sort of gets amplified because 20% of a bigger and bigger number gives you a bigger seasonal pattern. Okay. So the multiplicative model, again, the way I like to tell people to think about it is think of the seasonal pattern as a percentage. The alternative is an additive model, one where um, you simply are adding, subtracting a certain amount to capture the seasonal pattern. We sell 1,000 units more in December. We sell 100 units less in February. And even though in this example, the series has trended upwards, you can see that peak to trough is consistent because we're not multiplying numbers in to get the seasonal pattern. We're adding and subtracting. If you put these two types of seasonal patterns around the other trend versions, you can see how they impact. Notice if it's not trended, it doesn't matter. Okay. Some of these models have names. So I mentioned that exponential smoothing is a family of models. The 12 models that are on the screen is often called the Holt-Winters family of exponential smoothing models. And there was a very good researcher named Everett Gardner. He was a forecaster for the Navy. He also worked at Texas A&M University. And he was a real authority on exponential smoothing models. He wrote a couple of articles for the International Journal of Forecasting, where he surveyed all the different types of exponential smoothing and made a strong case that these are the 12 models to really concentrate on. So if you've heard of things like single exponential smoothing or double or triple exponential smoothing or adaptive response rate exponential smoothing, these are all alternative models. And Everett Gardner really made a strong case that many of them are just special cases of these models and restrictive cases, and that these are the ones to concentrate on. Three of the models have names. Simple exponential smoothing is the model that corresponds to the data are not trended or the forecast won't be trended and it's not seasonal. The Holt model assumes a linear trend, and the Winters model assumes both trend and seasonal pattern, and that the seasonal pattern is multiplicative. Sometimes people call this additive model here an additive Winters, but the original model as proposed by Winters was a multiplicative model. So it's just useful to be aware that the simple, Holt, and Winters, those are terms that if you're reading a forecasting textbook or using software, you'll often see referenced. What about the other models? Okay, we've got 12. How do we identify them? In the literature and in software, when these models are supported, people often use two letters to describe which model they're using. The first letter is for what type of trend. N for it's not trended, L for linear trend, D for damped trend, E for exponential trend. The second letter is used to identify the type of seasonality. N for it's not seasonal, A for additive, M for multiplicative. So if I say something like I built an LA model, that means I built a model with a linear trend and an additive seasonal pattern. Okay, so it's just a little nomenclature for being able to say, here's the model I used. Okay, so how do I choose a model? I've got these 12 different models to choose from, and now which one do I want to use? Well, there are different ways of doing this. I could use my own knowledge of the data. Um, I could use a visual inspection of the data. I could use an automatic algorithm. So let's look back at that data we saw before and think about that. So here's the data. I have it in Forecast Pro now. And as I look at the data, so now we're talking about visual inspection. It's pretty clear when we have enough data that it's trended. So I'd be able to eliminate all the non-trended models from consideration. It's also visually, and I could maybe look at this, say, year over year. If I look at this, as you look at things year over year, if you're looking for a seasonal pattern, what you do is you go from month to month. And the question is, as I go from November to December, how many went up and how many went down? In this case, they all went down. And as I go from December to January, how many went up and how many went down? In this case, they all went up. So that's saying they're moving together. As I go from January to February, not all of them went up, but many did. Okay. So if I look at this kind of graph, I'm trying to say, are they moving together? And if a lot of, it doesn't have to be perfect, but if a lot of times they're moving together, then it's telling you it's seasonal. And definitely, as someone who's looked at a lot of these graphs, this is a very seasonal series. Okay. So again, how do we choose our model? Visual inspection. That's when I look at this, I sort of pretty clearly see we've got a seasonal pattern, we've got some trends. There's this question of additive versus multiplicative. And for that, I'm kind of looking for the peak to troughs. As we get bigger, do they fan out? Um, I think you could do this either way. Some people might say, yeah, they seem to get bigger as you go to the right. There's the series increases. Others might say, well, you know, there's some big ones in the beginning too. So this is a little harder, but what we're after is the seasonal pattern additive or multiplicative? And the visual inspection's a little tough with that one. The third method was an automatic algorithm. And actually, when you use Forecast Pro, it'll automatically build a forecast for each and every item you bring in. So I'm actually going to turn on the forecasts here. And here's the model that Forecast Pro built. And you can see it does continue a trend and it has a seasonal pattern. If I go over here to this report, it tells me that it chose exponential smoothing. It could have chosen other methods like machine learning or Box Jenkins or what have you. But for this data set, it shows exponential smoothing. And it shows a linear trend and an additive seasonal pattern. So it did choose an LA model, that's shown here. And the model has 3 smoothing weights. Now we're going to do this in slides, but I'm going to talk a little bit about it while we have it on the screen. The smoothing weights control how much emphasis to give recent history versus past for each component. They vary between 0 and 1. So if something is close to 0, that's a very small smoothing weight, and if it's close to 1, it's a very large one. For the level, we have a very small smoothing weight, 0.03. And what that's saying is we want to do a lot of smoothing. So the smaller the weight, the more smoothing. So to get that local level, we're going to use a lot of data. On the other hand, the trend is very large. It's close to 1, 0.99. So as we're getting the trend component, we're really going to concentrate on the recent history because the trends are changing rapidly. And we saw that in the data. The seasonal pattern is kind of a moderate value, 0.24. So it's doing some smoothing, but it's also giving some emphasis to recent history. And again, this is kind of a nice example in that we've got 3 very different smoothing weights for the different components. For those of you who have used or are familiar with triple exponential smoothing, it basically is the Winters model, but it constrains these smoothing weights to be the same value. So they'd all be 0.1 or 0.2 or 0.3. That's an easier model to optimize. It's quicker to build. But in this case, it'd be a really bad idea because some of these components are requiring a lot of smoothing and some are not. And this is an example of what Eb Gardner pointed out in his article, which was, triple exponential smoothing, which was a very commonly used technique at the time. is really a restrictive case of the Winters model and should be avoided. So the smoothing weights control the rate of adaptivity, and there's a smoothing weight for each component. The other part of this display are the final values. These are how we build the forecasts. The final value for the level is 65,782, so it's right about here. Okay, so at the end of the data set, we've got a certain level, and it's a starting point for the forecast. The final value for the trend is 742 units a month. So the upward trend is going to go up by 742 units a month. So these final values are giving you information about the components. We've built an additive model. And the last component is the seasonal pattern. So we know what the starting point, we know the trend, and to get the seasonal pattern, we're going to go through each month. We'll see this in slides in a second, but we've got these 12 indices: January, February, March, April, May, June, etc. And we're going to add, if these are positive, a certain amount for January to raise it up. And if the months, the not so good months, we're going to, there, you'll see these negatives, we're going to subtract off. So this is how we actually create the forecast. We'll see it on slides. And before I move to the slides, I'm actually going to change the model to be multiplicative, just because the slides talk about it and I want to make sure you understand the different approaches. So what I've done is to specify that I want to use a Winters model, and that's a multiplicative model. It has changed the forecasts a little bit, but not a lot. These are going to have very similar forecasts. The smoothing weights will be different, but pretty similar. The level is 0.03. That's still very small. The trend is pretty big, 0.99. Seasonal is 0.20. So yes, the values are different, but they're similar because the rates of adaptivity are the same. It's the same data set. The big difference, though, is in the final values. The level and the trend are about the same, but the seasonal patterns are now above and below 1. There's not positive, there's not negative ones. And what we're going to do is to multiply these in to get the seasonal pattern. So, for example, if we look at this, our biggest one, I'm just kind of looking through here, appears to be March. We've got a value of 1.08. If I multiply something by 1.08, I'm going to raise it by 8%. So what that's basically saying is March is a strong month. It's about 8% higher than an average month. Our lowest one is December. We don't install as many systems in December as in other months. Its value is 0.81. If I multiply something by 0.81, I'm going to lower it by 19%. Okay, so it's saying December installations are down 19% compared to an average month. So again, one of the nice things about exponential smoothing is not only do you get a forecast, but you also get these final values, which really tell you something about the different components. Okay, let's switch back to our slides. And we've just run through some of this. But again, how do we determine which of those 12 we're going to use? We can use our own knowledge of the data. We tend to know if things are trended or seasonal because we work for the company. We can do a visual inspection of the data to get a feel for it, which is particularly useful if I've got enough data. In this case, we had 6 years. I can use an automatic algorithm, which will just use statistics to do it. I'll say the following, and this is kind of why we went through that Excel example. Automatic algorithms tend to work pretty well if you have enough data. But if you have, certainly if you have less than 2 years worth of data, these automatic algorithms are going to be kind of suspect. You'll want to keep your eye on them. And in cases where your domain knowledge tells you that no, the data are seasonal and I'm not building a seasonal model, then you're going to want to go in there and make some changes. Okay, the next couple slides walk through what we did on the screen, but let's kind of go through them. So you can see on the right-hand side of the slide, we have the same display we were just looking at. The smoothing weights take on values between 0 and 1. The larger the value, that is the closer to 1, the more emphasis on recent history. And obviously, the closer it is to zero, the more smoothing. A best practice is to optimize the weights to minimize the fitted error. And the good news about this is that's something that computers are really good at. So we can just use an automatic algorithm to do that. Using a single weight for the different components or using preset standard values, which the smoothing in Excel does, is not a good idea. And again, Everett Gardner's article told us that. And in our example here, we've got a good example where you really want those smoothing weights to be different, okay? Because the components are changing at different rates. Okay, moving on to the final values. I referred to these as the building blocks of the forecasts. So the forecast, our first forecast will be for June, and it's going to start at the level. It's going to add a trend because we're going 1 month ahead. And it happens to, and again, because it's June, we will multiply by June's index. So our starting level is 65,870, so we can pop that in there. Our trend is 779 units a month. And our index for June is 1.03. So I've just put the values into the little formula here. And if I do the arithmetic, it'll give me a forecast of 68,682. And indeed, you can see that that's the forecast that was calculated by the program. Similarly, for July, I can do the same thing, put in the level, 65,870. I'm going out 2 months, so I'm going to need two trends. So I'll put that in there. And I'm forecasting July, so I'll need to use July's index, which is 1.027. I do that arithmetic, and I get my second forecast. So it's a very, very straightforward method. I use smoothing weights to determine how much emphasis to give the different components in terms of weighting the current or previous history. Once I have that, I calculate final values. Once I have the final values, I can calculate the forecasts. And as mentioned before, the output is not only the forecast, but also these final values, because this tells you stuff about your data. What is the trend? You know, we're going up by 779 units a month. What does the seasonal pattern look like? Which months are good months? Which months are not so good months? So there's interpretation here, and that's nice. Okay, so that's the basics of the Holt-Winters family of models. And there are numerous extensions to the Holt-Winters family. And we have a certain amount of time left, so I'm going to talk a little bit about them. Some of the ones that are included in Forecast Pro, we have something called the NaCl model. We sometimes call it the SALT model. I'm actually going to show you this, but it's good for things that have what I call a selling season. There are certain times of the year where we sell these products and other times where we don't. So we'll see an example of this in a minute. The Croston's intermittent demand model. This is a technique, it's a form of exponential smoothing that's good when your data have a lot of zero demand periods. So think spare parts or slow movers where, you know, on a typical week or a typical month, we don't sell any. And it's a technique that's designed to handle that type of data. We won't actually run through it because we don't have enough time, but if you have that kind of data, it's very useful. We will take a quick look at the custom component model. This is a model where some of the components you estimate from the data and others you can customize. So we'll see how that works. And then the last one is actually an extremely useful one, something called event models. And event models have been the subject of their own webinar. And as Sabina told us in the beginning, we have a YouTube channel and a webinars on demand on the website. And if you want to learn more about event models, I encourage you to watch those videos. And again, they're free. But this is where you have things that are moving around the calendar. So things like promotions that move around or business interruptions. We also have some videos about forecasting during COVID and after COVID, where these event models become very, very useful. So again, we don't have the time to go into event modeling, but I do encourage you to watch some of those videos because it's a very, very useful technique. Okay, so let's talk about the first extension, which we call the NaCl model. And for those with a little chemistry background, NaCl, sodium chloride, is the nomenclature for salt, and sometimes we call this the salt model. The method will often improve forecast accuracy for data sets that have what I call a selling season. So think about things like snow shovels or flu vaccines. There's only certain times of the year where you're going to sell snow shovels. In North America, during the winter, we're going to sell snow shovels. In the summer, not so much, and most of the stores won't even have them out in display, for example. It's a variation of exponential smoothing, whereby the smoothing weight is forced to something very small, and in this case, 0.0001. The concept here is we're not going to allow the level to change very rapidly. And this is, we'll see how this works. So the model is an NA, so it's not trended. It has an additive seasonal model. It has a constant level. By forcing it to be very low, it's not allowing the level to change. So it's a constant level model. It works quite well. Forecast Pro can automatically determine when the model should be used. And currently, Forecast Pro is the only place it's implemented. This was something that we implemented in response to a data set I'm about to show you. So Forecast Pro has a very large installed base, and we've been on the market a long time. And there are lots of times where people will send us data, and that's what happened here. So this data was sent by a company that is trying to forecast. This is weekly data, and they're forecasting sales of agrochemical products. So things like growth agents, stuff that you would put on crops to promote their growth. And you can see they're very seasonal, and that there are certain times of the year where sales are very low, where there's just not a lot of growth agents being done. They also sell pesticides, and these are even more pronounced as we look through them. You're going to find certain products that they're just not sold at certain times of the year. So this is all zero, but they have this kind of season where they do sell. And it starts and stops at different times depending on things like the weather. So that, yes, there's a selling season, but the exact timing of it is not really known. And so these pesticides, you can get a feel for what they look like. Very seasonal, but certain times of the year where you sell a lot, others where you might not sell much at all. Okay. Um, I'm going to turn on, you can see, I'm going to turn on the forecast for this. It did use the SALT model, and you can see it's a very reasonable forecast. Okay. The model's over here. We used expert selection, so it automatically chose the SALT model. It's not trended, additive seasonal with a constant level. And you can see that smoothing weight is restricted to 0.001. Now, what if we had done, again, we mentioned that we developed these models in response to these types of data sets. And before we developed them, you'd look at this and say, well, you want to use something like an LA model. It's because it's not trended and it is seasonal. So what happens if you do that? And I'm going to go ahead and do that. So I'm going to go under custom. I'm going to say, give me a linear trend and an additive seasonal pattern and press OK. And this is what you get. And this is why the customer sent us this data. They said, I can't submit that. I'll lose my job. Okay. But the basic Holt Winters framework really can't forecast this. And what's happening is that the fact that this is changing has gotten the smoothing weight for the level to be very, very high. And because the data end, if something's high, it's concentrating on the recent history. And it's just absolutely dominating any seasonality that's there. So you really want the ability to sort of hold that level constant. You don't want it to change. What you're really trying to forecast is deviations from that constant level. And that's what the constant level model does. So if I go back to the NaCl, I get a much better forecast. So again, given our limited time, I'm going to leave it there. But suffice it to say that this is a very useful model when you have selling seasons. It's also useful for certain types of seasonal patterns, even when you don't have selling seasons. So, and the product can automatically choose when it's appropriate, and the model comes into play quite a bit. So again, some of these extensions we're just going to look at real quickly. The next one we're going to look at, we're back to this internet data, the installation data, is the custom component model. And so we've already talked about this model. We talked that it has a level and a trend and a seasonal pattern. And the question is, what if I want to change one of these? And the example I'm going to do here, I'm going to choose custom component. Actually, before I do that, I'm going to change the forecast horizon. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to do something that I don't recommend, which is I'm going to take a monthly data set and I'm going to forecast it out 5 years. So exponential smoothing is really kind of a short-term technique because we're saying that things can change in time. And if I forecast this out for the next 5 years, that trend is just assumed to continue that way, and that's not very likely. So usually exponential smoothing, you think of it as a short-term forecasting method. What does that mean? As in how far out can I forecast? It depends a little bit on how rapidly things are changing, but usually, 12 to 18 months is fairly typical, and certainly you don't want to go out 5 years. But again, this is just an example. So what the custom component model allows you to do is to say the starting point is what we have on the screen. Okay, so I'm showing the underlying trend, and you can see it's just a linear trend that has a certain slope, that 700, in this case 42, for the next 5 years. Let's say that I look at that and I say, I think it's too aggressive, and I want to change it. I could come down here and just edit the forecast numerically. So this is an override facility here, an override grid. But the custom component model says you have these different components. You have this one labeled starting point. It's basically the final level. You have the trend, in this case, a linear trend, and it has a certain slope, etc. You have seasonal indices. So this is all just exponential smoothing. This example, we don't have events, but we could, okay? And the concept is I want to change one or more of the components. So let's say I look at that trend and I say, it's too aggressive, I want to pull it down. Now, I could do that a bunch of different ways. So I'll choose a different trend. Instead of linear automatic, I'm going to do bent custom, okay? So I want to change this trend. And I could do it several different ways, but I'm going to do it by changing the total forecast. So the total forecast currently is 5,305,000. But let's say I want to do, let's change it to 4,000,005, I have to type well, 4,500,000. Let's see, hopefully I got my zeros right there. And let's let that fly. And what you can see is now instead of that straight line trend, it's now bent. And that forecast will sum to 4.5 million. So again, this is a bit of a whirlwind look at this, but the main concept we have here on this custom component model, again, is, I'll go ahead and add that line back in, is that I've estimated different components using exponential smoothing, but then I have the ability to go in and modify any of them. So it's kind of a form of customizing some of the components, estimating others from the data. Okay, we're going to go back to our slides and kind of wrap this up. We walked through the custom component model. So I've already talked about all of this, but basically, again, we can customize some of these components and let other ones be estimated from the data. It's useful for a variety of situations, customizing the trend for a longer term forecast. That's the example we showed. Customizing seasonal patterns for short data sets. So let's say I don't have a lot of data, but I want to use a specific seasonal pattern, maybe from, say, other products in the product line. Then I could use this to do it. I could use this to define the impact of future events that have not occurred historically. So these are the event models that we were talking about. Okay, so it's a very useful method, and it allows you to customize your models. Okay, so let's summarize, and then we'll have some time for questions. Exponential smoothing is a very useful time series method. It's easy to apply. It's easy to explain to people how it works. It revolves around three data components: level, trend, seasonal pattern. It's adaptive to change. As these components change in time, it's adapting to that change. The forecasts reflect current conditions, those final values we've been looking at. And because it reflects current conditions and we know things will change in the future, it's best used for shorter term forecasting. For monthly data sets, again, maybe 12 to 18 months might be typical. There are some very useful extensions to the basic Holt-Winters models, and we've taken a look at a few of them. There are others. Okay, so with that, that's the formal part of the webinar is over.
Thank you, Eric, for a great presentation. We will get to your Q&A shortly. Just a reminder to submit your questions during using the Q&A functions. Today's webinar was brought to you by a partnership between Supply Chain Business Solutions and Business Forecast Systems. As I said, please submit your questions as such, and obviously we will email you the link of the webinar recording next week. And as we said before, all previously presented webinars are available or are archived and are available. And attendees will receive email notifying them it is available. Before we go on to the Q&A, I just want to remind you about a couple of upcoming webinars. The first one we are running is on November 13th, 2024, Australian time, 2 p.m. Australian time as such. This will focus more on using the Forecast Flow software and will offer a deep dive into the using override grid in Forecast Flow. You can sign up by visiting the link on the screen or scanning the QR code on the screen. After that, we are going to be running an online 3-day workshop on business forecasting techniques, best practices, and application using Forecast Pro. That will be the 3-day workshop will cover various forecasting methodology and techniques and demonstrate the best practices. They're a great way to depend your forecasting knowledge, whether you are brand new to forecasting or have been using it for years. As you would have seen that today's webinar, Eric was using Forecast Flow software. If you'd like to learn more about Forecast Flow software, reach out to us. You can request a demo right now by using the QR code sort of thing or your control panel, or feel free to call us or visit our website as listed on this particular slide per se. You can also download a free trial of the software at forecastflow.com as well. Okay, now we are on to the questions and answer session. Eric, we have a number of questions. I compiled a list of questions for you, and let's just see how many questions we can get to. The first question is, Eric, you advise triple exponential smoothing should be avoided. What is the reason for this, please?
Triple exponential smoothing is actually a special case of the Winters model. And it's the case where the smoothing weights for the level, the trend, and the seasonal components are all constrained to equal the same value. And that means that as far as calculations go, it's much quicker because I'm optimizing only one number instead of three. Unfortunately, it forces the rate of change for the level, the trend, and the seasonal component to be all the same. And that results in poor forecasts when those levels are changing differently. So again, it's a restrictive case of the Winters model, and it really should be avoided.
Thanks, Eric. The next question, how do you measure the accuracy of your methodology before deploying the forecasting model? Do you split your database between training and test, forecast based on the training, then measure accuracy against the test?
Okay. That is certainly one way of doing this. And the what you're describing there is what I would call an out of sample test. Some people call it an ex post forecast, some people call it a simulation. But the idea is that I have the historic data, and instead of using all of it, I'm going to withhold data from the end. So let's say I reserve the last 6 months, for example. I use the beginning part of the data, not including those 6 months. I build a smoothing model and I forecast the remaining 6 months that I did not use. And then I can compare the forecasts that were generated against what actually happened. So it's sort of like saying, if 6 months ago we used exponential smoothing, how close would we have been? So that's called an out of sample test or holdout sample. For those using Forecast Pro, it is built right into the software. It's very easy to do. And that indeed is one way that you can measure the accuracy of your forecasting methodology before deploying the model. We do have webinars that are on the website that talk about forecast accuracy and evaluation. And so for more detail, you may want to consult one of those. Um, the, the other thing you can do is as you go live with a forecasting system, you want to be saving your forecasts so that as the future unfolds, you can compare the forecast you generated to what actually happened. And that allows you not only to test, say, the accuracy of an exponential smoothing model, but also of your forecasting process. So if you're adding, making overrides and other changes to the model, you can see if those are adding or destroying value. So lots of ways of doing that, but indeed what was described is a common way and built right into Forecast Pro, as well as real-time tracking also being built into the software. But essentially, it's important to monitor the accuracy of your forecasts. You want to understand where am I performing well and where can I potentially find places where I can improve the process. And there's an old adage that says you can't improve what you don't measure. And that's certainly true in forecasting. You want to track the accuracy of your forecasts so you can improve your forecasting process. I think we probably have time for one more question.
Thanks, Eric. Next question. What does R squared mean for exponential smoothing?
Okay, the R squared is not particularly designed for exponential smoothing. It's a generic within sample statistic, and it's designed to measure how well you fit the historic data. So it's not really a measure of forecast accuracy. It's a measure of model fit. And the R squared tells you the percentage of the variation that you're explaining um, with the fit. So an R squared of 0.75 would say I am explaining 75% of the variation that occurs in the data with the model. So it's a useful statistic. It's one people often learn in some dreaded statistics course, and it has more to do with fitting the data as opposed to expectations on forecast accuracy. So again, I would say in the context of exponential smoothing, it's not super common to be watching the R squared. Okay. Um, that's all the time we have for Q&A, and I'd like to thank everybody for taking some time out of their day and learning a bit about exponential smoothing.
Okay, all right. Unfortunately, we run out of time to take any further questions. If we haven't answered your questions, we will be sending you an email as a follow-up and make sure that your questions get answered. So thank you everybody for attending this particular webinar, and it's bye from us from here today.